Okay, so we are live. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in MedGlobal's second live stream webinar discussing topics that are relevant to providing healthcare support worldwide. I'm Tanya Baban, and I am MedGlobal's country representative in Beirut, Lebanon, and I will be moderating this session to discuss the impact of migration on health in Latin America from Guayaquil to Tapachula. We know that Venezuela is facing a displacement crisis over the past few years, and this humanitarian crisis has become the second largest international displacement crisis in the world. By August of 2022, more than 6.8 million Venezuelans were living outside of Venezuela, and that is an 8,000% increase in the number of Venezuelans seeking refugee status worldwide since 2014. This is the largest exodus in the Western Hemisphere and second only to the Syrian crisis. There's been rampant violence, inflation, gang warfare, and soaring crime rates, as well as shortage in food, medicine, and essential healthcare services that have forced millions to seek refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. These countries primarily being Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. But the capacity of these countries to provide basic services have become increasingly strained, and people continue to leave Venezuela at an average of 5,000 refugees per day. Unfortunately, the continuously deteriorating political situation, as well as the social and economic sectors in Venezuela, have all combined to produce a completely collapsed healthcare sector. And this collapse has manifested as a lack of medications, medical supply, and human resources, where many healthcare workers have chosen to migrate to seek a better life. Assessment by the UNHCR indicate that food, healthcare, protection, and wash support are among the most urgent humanitarian needs among vulnerable populations, including the Venezuelans and the Colombian returnees from Venezuela and their host communities. MedGlobal has been present in Colombia serving the Venezuelan migrants and refugees since 2019 and is currently expanding its activities to Ecuador and the US-Mexican border in 2022. This session will offer a panoramic view of the migration crisis in Latin America and the efforts that have been made by MedGlobal to address the health-related issues. I am proudly joined today by our field team from Colombia and Venezuela, Ms. Angela Restrepo and Dr. John Kaler. Welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Ms. Angela is our MedGlobal Program Manager for Colombia and Venezuela. She is an internationalist and a political scientist with expertise in interinstitutional cooperation and migration. She's based in Calcutta right now, and she works closely with the local stakeholders to manage the needs of the Venezuelan migrants and the refugees in Colombia. While Dr. Kaler is one of our co-founders for MedGlobal, and throughout his career, Dr. Kaler has been interested in global health and has generously participated as a volunteer in many humanitarian works worldwide. In 2016, he dedicated his time to the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan, Lebanon, and Greece. And since 2018, Dr. Kaler has taken a particular interest and has been responsible for the MedGlobal projects in Colombia. I'm also very proud to say that Dr. Kaler was honored as an American Red Cross Disaster Service Hero in 2019. So thank you so much for being with us, Angela and Dr. Kaler. That being said, let me dive right in. My first question, since we already mentioned that MedGlobal has been operating in Colombia since 2019, can you please describe the health gaps that were faced by Venezuelans in Cucuta at the time, and in what ways was MedGlobal able to respond to alleviate this extra burden on the healthcare systems that were being faced at the time?
Angela, you're mute.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, well, Tanya, your question is really interesting. When we just came by first time in 2019, we start by building a primary healthcare center in a really crowded area in Cucuta, basically where most migrants and refugees were coming to reside and live in. And we fastly become a general medicine health center, but also with the time we start seeing as a prenatal care center, essentially because we committed to provide a high quality service for pregnant women, and also because this at the time and as of today is one of the top needs in terms of health regarding to Venezuelan migrants and refugees living in Colombia and in other countries in South America. So we quickly became a women and children healthcare center where we provided general medicine, prenatal care, specialized care for pregnant women, and growth and development for children. And this was an extensive program between 2019 and 2022. And when we just closed as we move forward to work with other populations, target populations as los caminantes or the walkers, the people who was moving out from Venezuela looking for other destinations. And of course, now as we are working with the pendular movement population, that is the people who is living in Venezuela and that is closing on a daily and weekly basis to Colombia to receive all the services because there is, of course, still a lack of services, mainly health services in Venezuela. So since we moved to that, of course, there are a lot of gaps and challenges for them to access the healthcare system. And it's basically because of two reasons. The first one, I would say, is the lack of legal documentation. Even with the ones who are residing in the country, they do have a long process to follow to receive legal documents, in Colombia and to access to the healthcare system. And this, of course, this point affects to the ones who are in pendular movement because since they are not living or residing permanently in Colombia, they are not accessing to this kind of mechanisms to access to documents and to the healthcare, to the Colombian healthcare system. And the second reason, of course, is like in Colombia, still in Colombia, there is a high demand on health services by Colombians, and now with the Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees as part of the system, of the healthcare system, of course, there is a major burden in accessing on real time to high quality healthcare services. So this is, of course, problematic and that needs to be addressed by in any time by the government, by the Colombian government, but that also needs the support from the international community and cooperation in order to make a sustainable and quality healthcare system for both Colombians and Venezuelans.
Let me just add on that a couple of things. One is, please put on the first couple of slides. When we first came down there, here's Dr. Salul and I at the border. When we first, next one too, but when we first came down to do a needs assessment, could I have the next slide up, please? When we first come down to do the needs assessment, there were somewhere between 25 and 30,000 people crossing this bridge that you see us standing on right now. The vast majority of those people were what Angela referred to as pendulares, meaning they came over to Colombia because there was nothing, and this is a picture of what it looked like when we were down there. They came over from Colombia, were permitted to cross. This was in December 2018 and into spring of 2019. They were permitted to cross. They did the shopping in Cucuta, and the vast majority of them went back within 7 days. So of that 20,000, maybe 5,000 continued along walking. Just continued along walking. That'll be enough slides. Thank you. Continued along walking. Those were called the caminantes, and the rest went back. And about 10% every day would take up residence in the Cucuta Norte Santander area. I should mention, this is a picture of the walkers. I should mention that we are lucky that we are literally at the border. We are on the bridge that you saw Dr. Salul and I standing on was the bridge that connects Venezuela and Cucuta, Táchira, Venezuela, Norte de Santander, in Colombia, and we have presences on both sides of that bridge, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. All of this changed a little bit later on after we were there because of political strife. The previous president, President Duque of Colombia, shut the border. down. And
Yes.
so it became very difficult to get across. And as Angela mentioned, there was a group of people that continued to cross. All it was more difficult to get across, and they crossed what are called the river crossing, or the Slochas. And you were estimating anywhere between 5 and 7,000 people a day at that site coming across in Norte
Oh,
de Santander. Not all along the river, but in Norte de Santander. Again, those people would come just to get supplies and take them back and forth, or they would just end up going, or they would just end up either staying or moving south. That was the picture in 2019, early 2019, when we set up our clinic. We planned and we established 2 or 3. We used the hub and spoke model. We planned and set up Pumaneros, which is the clinic Angela mentioned, which was our large center. And from there, we had several smaller places that we would go out in a mobile aspect to see those itinerants that couldn't come in or that were traveling. We would use that clinic as the place we would send them back for ongoing care. So we had planned on expanding that model, but of course, you hear me talking about 2019, and we all know what comes comes on, and COVID comes along.
Which leads me to
COVID comes along, and
question, because you were there before the pandemic, and that's when, while you were setting up all of this and working on the PHC clinics and seeing almost 5,000 patients a day, that's when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. How did this affect the response in general at the time where the borders shut down? And what measures did you have to take to not only respond to the COVID-19, but to continue your ongoing projects
Angela?
in that kind of situation and crowd?
I'm very proud of our work during the COVID thing because we helped very much. Angela, you want to go into that, please?
Yes, Tanya. In fact, during 2020, we strengthened our position as MedGlobal in country, essentially because we maintain our primary health care center open. Of course, we have a lot of challenges faced basically because our staff they got COVID-19. So we have a COVID outbreak by August 2020, but we had the opportunity to serve the community who was highly affected because they didn't have like a place where to go if they needed health services. But during 2020, I think the pandemic just worsened the healthcare system in all aspects. So other things like general medicine or prenatal care or growth and development or nutrition as and mental health services were in a second place, and because the first place was of course to to face the COVID-19 situation in country.
Is it,
So,
oh, sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
is it a lack of funding or a lack of resources?
And by that time, it was a lack of resources in terms of human resources and in terms of food of medical supplies, in terms of tests, COVID-19 tests by that time. So everybody was so overwhelmed in the hospitals, the clinics, and the ICU occupation, basically because there was a lack of resources. And of course, as MedGlobal I was mentioning, we maintain open by offering those other services, general medicine, prenatal care, growth and development, everything that was necessary for this population. But we could donate 2 ventilators to the ICU occupation in Cucuta at the public hospital, Erasmo Meos Public Hospital, because at that moment there was a huge need in the city. So that was like a double response that we had during the
Right.
pandemic.
Yeah.
And by the other way, John, and you remember, we also, during pandemic, there was like a phenomenon that a lot of migrants and refugees that were living in Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru, they basically, and also Colombia, they lost their jobs because of the pandemic
Yeah.
situation. And they had to return to Venezuela. Essentially, they had no place where to live, no work or jobs in their location. So they decided to go back to Venezuela, and we were at the first refugee camp in Colombia, that Tienditas Bridge, and where we basically could offer healthcare services during the night shift for the people or the population who was um, staying there, waiting for the right time to go back home. So this was like a three times response during all the pandemic, and of course after that in 2021, because I'm referring to 2020. In 2021, what we could offer at Los Caminantes site where were working was to offer a COVID-19 testing site, essentially the only one in all the Caminantes routes where we could provide more than 5,000 COVID-19 tests to the population who was constantly moving from one city to other. So that was like the other response we have in terms of COVID. That's the way we could face the challenges, overcome the challenges, and of course to have really good lessons learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, let me add on to that Colombia did a very good job from a public health standpoint in shutting things down. I mean, unlike the United States, when they say it shut down, it was closed down. It just so happened we were doing a short-term medical intervention as all of this happened, and a colleague of mine, a longtime volunteer, Dr. Peter Houck, and I got the last flight out of Bogota before they shut the country down.
Right.
And what Angela was referring to is one of the things in Colombia, unlike in the Middle East that you're probably more used to, is there are no refugee camps, zero. It's against the law. They were not set up. Everything was itinerant or moving along. During COVID, during this reverse migration, as Angela alluded to, this was the first time there actually was a enclosure set up to house over 300 people as they were permitted to move back into Venezuela. Because Venezuela at that time actually opened up and said that these folks could come back in. There was nowhere for them to go, but this was the first time there was a actual tent operation that you could, a camp of one type or the other that you can see, and we help staff.
Interesting, because I know the whole world was going through it at the time, but based on the work we do on the field, we were also faced with a very similar situation. But like you said, even though in Lebanon we are allowed to set up temporary camps, unfortunately, it is against the law to make any sort of changes to these camps to make those residences more permanent. So that doesn't allow us to actually give the refugees a decent form of housing either, and they keep moving back and forth between the border because they have nowhere else to go.
Anyway, in answer to the question I asked earlier, it was obviously a combination of resources and money. Money always trumps everything else, of course, because when the money is there, the resources can be dug out. And what happened at the public hospital is one major public hospital in Norte de Santander, and that's in Cucuta, is a hospital called Meos. They did a very appropriate public health situation, which is this is the tropics, so you don't have to worry about cold. And so they moved all of their COVID-related activities into tents outside the main hospital.
Yeah, right.
That was a very productive thing they did, and I think it helped save a lot of lives. We happened to have lost a close friend of ours during that time, a young man of early 30s. He was a lawyer. He worked with us in helping us establish our program, and this young man died of COVID. And it was one of I think it was probably our only major loss of ours, meaning folks that were
So I want to go over something that Angela briefly maybe mentioned in the previous question. I mean, the majority of Venezuelans lack documentation and obviously have no guaranteed access to basic rights. And this makes them vulnerable to heightened risks of exploitation, violence, and discrimination. And we do know that for the Venezuelan refugees who could prove a residence, that in December of 2020, the Colombian government granted like a special protection status that allows them access to social service benefits, including the public healthcare system. How has the Colombian public healthcare system prepared to absorb this extra burden, and how are the refugees with no documentation able to access healthcare and or medication?
Well, they actually did before Angela dives into that. Let me just add that they actually did two things in December uh, of 2020, 2021. I'm sorry. One is that they did this special status that you talked about. The other thing they did was they decided that to help all of those Venezuelans that were moving south, they would set up a series of health centers, essentially. They would alternate them, one large to one small, and that way they would clear the road that they were walking on from all these small little NGOs that would set up a tent here or a table there, and they would actually set up a series of sanitarias, what they call them, that would benefit those caminantes, the walkers, as they move south. It's a problematic story, but they did both of those, and much to everybody's surprise, because the Duque government was not particularly friendly with the Venezuelan government. And so much to everybody's surprise, without extra resources, and after and during COVID, they set these two programs up. So,
Right.
Angela, you want to address how well the public health system is identified with, or
Yes.
dealt with this?
Yes, well, I mean, there exists a mechanism for Venezuelan migrants and refugees residing in Colombia to access in a long period to the healthcare system. But there's still, of course, a big burden between accessing to in time a healthcare service by the Colombian government, provided by the Colombian government. And this is exactly what is going on, what is happening right now with Colombians, that they need to basically sue the state so they can get an appointment with a specialist to get a surgery, even if it's like a major surgery and it's important or
This is
threatening
for
the life.
Colombians or
Yes,
the
this is
locals.
Colombia. Yes. So normally, if you are in a subsidiary regime, it means that you are covered by the public health system. You will need to wait more than 2 months or 4 months for a specialist appointment. If you are dealing with a
Right.
cancer or HIV and you need treatment right now, you need to follow a lot of steps and procedures until you get that real treatment on time. So this is in the case of Colombia, who have been fighting with the system for a couple of years. Now that we want to include 1.8 million of Venezuelans residing, according with the last census, in that healthcare system, of course, that is going to stress the capacity of the system to respond in an adequate way to those demands. And that's why, of course, some Venezuelans have told us basically that they will need to wait a lot of time just to receive a general medicine uh, consultation or even to receive a dental services. So this is how well is prepared the public healthcare system. It has a lot of problems, of course. I do agree with John that the past government they did the way before, trying to grant this protection status in order to avoid, in order to help Venezuelan migrants and refugees to be established and
Right.
to apply this social inclusion in Colombia, to find new jobs, to set up a startup, to start in a new life. But I must comment this on because this is the right time to do it. Recently, Colombia we changed from government, and nowadays there's still unclear how the healthcare system is going to respond to these new almost 2 million Venezuelans who are going to be registered, fully registered in Colombia and fully according to the old rights, including
Right.
health in the coming 2 years. So basically, that's where I think maybe there is a lack of planning and understanding on how the government is going to support us.
Let me just jump in, because two other things have changed even since then. The statistic that you might be looking for is that since that executive, it was an executive order. Since that executive order, of those Venezuelans, 1.2 million that would have been eligible at that time, somewhere around 25% have been registered, not received
Okay.
services, have been registered into the system. So it
A
looked
long
good.
process.
They slow walked it, and it's not going to be of much. I can't imagine it being of much use, because when you combine with that, that was the old government. The new government with President Petro, who is reestablished relationships with Venezuela. What the real goal for this is that the Colombian government, as well as the regional, I'm sure, but for sure the Colombian government wants to declare, the Colombian and Venezuelan government want to declare this problem over with. So they want to deal with the economics of rebuilding. They don't want this humanitarian thing. And in point of fact, even though these folks have been given permission, they're actually being encouraged to go back home. This is not racial remark. I mean, they're not being forced to go back home, but they certainly are going to be. They're certainly being encouraged, and they're going to be more encouraged to go back home, and that will lead to. It's going to lead this opening, along with the stuff going on at our border, is going to lead to a large pull of Venezuelans, which we're seeing, absolutely seeing, north. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
So yeah, so that's the perfect link to my next question, because I want to take us across the border a little bit. I know that in addition to the work in Colombia, that you have helped MedGlobal build a strong presence in Venezuela. And I want to know from your experience, first of all, what do you think the difference between the healthcare system in Venezuela is compared to Colombia? And in your opinion, if we were to focus on supporting the Venezuelan healthcare system, would that help ease the influx of migrants to Colombia and neighboring countries? Is this
So
the
the answer to your first question is, think about, I mean, it's the degree of difference is the difference between the United States and Mexico, between Colombia and Venezuela.
Wow.
And it's even, I mean, that's just a rough thing that most people understand. The real situation is the Venezuelan health system outside of the major cities, Caracas, Montevideo, outside of those cities has collapsed. It doesn't exist. And the difficulty with it is, unlike if we were going into Aleppo or Syria or somewhere and you saw buildings bombed out, Angela can tell you this story in San Antonio, which is the city on the other side of the border in Táchira, and the main city in San Cristobal, which is the capital of that region. You go and the buildings exist. They look nice. They have been built in the past 20 years, so they look nice. The simple issue is there's nothing in them. Angela, you want to add on that because you were there recently?
Yes, essentially, I'm just picking out what John said. You can find a really nice building. It almost looks like a private clinic, even if it's from the States. But when you go there, the first message you got from the house staff, it's like, oh, let's use the stairs, not the elevator, because we run out of electricity in any time, so we don't know. We don't want to get caught inside of the elevator. Then second, you will see that all the furniture and the medical equipment or doesn't exist or it's too old that you can even use them or work properly with that. And when we went exactly to the labor room, it is kind of sad, I would say, to see that there is no one over there. You could see the staff waiting for a pregnant woman to come. And you could see why. Because essentially they don't have medications, medical supplies. Let's say that it doesn't matter if the furniture is old, it doesn't matter if the medical equipment is not top quality or 2022 model, but let's just wait and stand on the point that there is not even in some gloves to use or medication. So if a pregnant woman wants to deliver in San Antonio, they will need to come to Cucuta, cross the border, purchase all the supplies. There is a list that they offer at the hospital, purchase all the supplies, and going back to San Antonio for delivering there. And what happened? I mean, the effect on that is exactly that you, as a pregnant woman, you don't feel safe on delivering in San Antonio. You prefer to cross a trocha or an illegal river crossing and deliver an Erasmus first because you don't have economic um, conditions to purchase that list of supplies. Even if it's cheap for us, it's not cheap for them. And second, because you, of course, there is a lack of confidence in the healthcare system in Venezuela. You are afraid to be referred to other cities just because the hospital has not capability. You are afraid about delivering in a hospital where electricity can fail every hour. So you prefer just to
There's,
close
there's an
20 minutes
emergency or a need
walking,
of
taking a taxi for 0.5 cents of the dollar, and going to Erasmus when you know that there will be uh, doctors, nurses, medical equipment, and medical supplies for free for you to deliver. So that's basically the summary of how the healthcare system in Venezuela is. And this has nothing to do with commercial relations and commercial exchange because it would take a lot of time to the Venezuelan healthcare system and essentially that's going to take a while when the people will feel again that they can go to their hospital to deliver to receive any healthcare services.
I don't need to add to that.
thank you. That's quite
That's well stated. The
so.
degree is that 40% of the deliveries at the Neos Public Hospital are Venezuelan migrants. I mean, that's a 60, no, 40% of that 40% are done by C-section because they don't have, at least 40%, because they don't have medical records. So that's the extent of what's going on.
Great. So that's a perfect dive into a bit more details of the program that you helped work on. I mean, let's go into the specific topic. In 2016, the official epidemiology report of the Venezuelan government reported an increase in maternal mortality
Yep.
of 65% in 1 year.
Yep.
And there have been numbers of 10,000 cases of maternal mortality reported in Colombia in 2019 alone amongst Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Um, we know that in 2018, the Colombian government defined a sort of emergency prenatal and child care service guideline resolution to include certain general services that are for pre and postnatal services for pregnant women in Colombia. And we were part of this, MedGlobal was part of this resolution when you implemented the prenatal care service that was provided. And I think, and forgive my pronunciation, the Norte de Santander region.
Very good. Yeah.
So if you can give us an idea of what the situation was like, I mean, if it was a 65% increase in mortality rate in 2016, and I can only imagine that gradually got worse. When you first arrived in 2019, what were you facing and what steps needed to be taken by MedGlobal to address this specific need in establishing a prenatal care program?
Well, our plan had been to establish both the prenatal program and in conjunction with the hospital meals. I mean, we knew where they were going, and it was quite obvious what the situation was. During 2021, we took care at some point in their pregnancy of over 22% of all the Venezuelan women that delivered at meals.
Wow.
So in addition, and I'm very proud to say that we set up and followed those guidelines to the letter. And unlike a lot of other places, we actually did follow the guidelines to the letter. At the third trimester, we transferred records to the hospital. The plan was to transfer records to the hospital so that those records would be there when the women came to deliver. With the abruption caused by COVID and that, the program was rolling when this all started, and COVID just stopped it cold. I mean, we had to switch our resources there. But that was the initial program. It started off well. We had the numbers. Our perinatal mortality rate is nowhere near that. I can't give you the exact figure right now. I don't know if Angela has it. We managed in the women that we took care of, we certainly managed to decrease that neonatal mortality rate. Maternal mortality rate. I'm not sure by what significance. So, but we set the program up. It was going, and then as all other things in the public health world, with COVID, it got affected.
Great, and I think I read in the report that as a response to what you were doing initially, I think the woman would come in quite late in their pregnancies during the third trimester, and then you started seeing maybe earlier presentation, so that would help you intervene at an earlier stage, which I think is a full-on recognition, hopefully, of the impact that you were able to do while you were doing that work. That's amazing.
Well, we certainly gave the services. I wish I could give you the number to tell you how much they affected, but we certainly presented the services. That's how it goes.
That's wonderful. So, I mean, not to make the situation even more complicated, but now we're faced with something else in more recent years, and we've been reading that more than tens of thousands of migrants now from Haiti and Venezuela, and even elsewhere, are risking their lives every month to now cross what is known as the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. And just to give a brief background to the people who tuned in, the Darien Gap is one of the world's most dangerous migration routes. And this is a remote roadless crossing on the border between Colombia and Panama, and it consists of more than 60 miles, almost 97 kilometers of dense rainforests, steep mountains, and vast swamps. Needless to say that people who have to walk through the Darien Gap will be facing a lot of tropical illnesses, wild animals, and attacks. And it is the only overland path connecting Central and South America. And over the past few years, it has become a leading transit point in search of work and safety in the United States, since authorities have strictly cracked down on other routes by air and by sea. And according to the Panamanian government, just to give you an idea of the number, that approximately 134,000 migrants have crossed the Darien Gap en route to the US in 2021, as opposed to a couple of hundred people a decade ago. And nearly 30,000 of these, of the 134,000 were children, some even less than 2 years old. So, Angela and Dr. Kaler, I've been informed that MedGlobal's next efforts in Latin America will be in Ecuador, at the Darien Gap specifically, and in Mexico. Could you please elaborate on what you're going to be working on, and how you feel that this will hopefully impact this new coming situation?
Just to make one quick correction, it's the Colombia-Panama border, not the Ecuador. We have a program in Ecuador. We certainly will talk about it. Angela, you want to talk about our relationship with PAHO, the Pan American Health Association?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Jan. Because of our work, we have been collaborating and working closely with PAHO, essentially to cover the health needs in these low resource areas, including Darien Gap, where we are evaluating to put together a community first aid training that could help and support the community from these small towns in Colombia to actually know how to respond in case if any medical response is needed, even during the way through the Darien Gap. And second, of course, we are mobilizing some resources and planning on some distribution right next in the Darien Gap, like water filters that could support the ones who are walking through the Darien Gap, um, just with the final purpose, sorry, of saving lives. Because this is not a matter of offering a continuous care and ongoing care or even a primary health care service. We are facing a different kind of emergency response, which the final object of any action from our end will be to help saving lives. Correct me, John, if I'm wrong. And then, of course, with PAHO, we are also evaluating to support other border areas with Venezuela, because essentially it's border areas where people is crossing from Venezuela to Colombia to go to the Darien Gap. So you could easily know by the needs assessment from PAHO, from Health Cluster, or from BIFEM, that 60% of the migrants who are crossing the border and walking, they are talking about going directly to the Darien Gap. So we are building that relation with PAHO um, and how to respond effectively on those areas that we already mentioned. This I just remarked that these are difficult areas. Even if we are in Colombia, really well established, it's difficult to work in these areas because of the security problems and the different groups that you are going to find with special interest on these route. But of course, we're conscious about that, and we are looking forward to establish a presence from Venezuela-Colombian border and Colombia-Panama border in order we can pick um, up to the north.
And this is. Let me just reemphasize. This is an extremely dangerous area. When the demographics of the transition, the demographics of the migration have changed. It used to be just men working their way north to work, and it was very difficult. But it was maybe a 3 or 4 day walk, very difficult, loss of life, no question about that. But these were men walking. The current situation is that these are families now going. These are women and children. So the opportunity for sexual exploitation, the opportunity for ongoing problems is increased by a power of 10. This is the reason that this is one of the reasons that the Pan American Health Organization has really taken an interest in setting up a public health program at that border. There are problems in Panama, so it's hard to do this in Panama. So our plan is to do it on the Colombia side of the border. Several large NGOs, such as Doctors Without Borders, that are on the Costa Rican side. So when you exit the border, when you exit the gap, you're in Costa Rica. There's several organizations set up there. There's very few that are set up on the entrance. I was recently in Tapachula and interviewing several young men that had come through there. And to a person, they had been terrified. They had all lost weight. They had all been sick. To even young men in their 18s to 22s, it's a terrible situation. For I can't even imagine what it would be for a mother carrying a child. And by the way, these are pregnant women that enter also, so there's deliveries that go on and things like that. This is the first major choke point on the trip north, and from the change in the geopolitics, people are now coming and moving north. This whole issue of now going, there's very few going on to Peru, into Ecuador. There's plenty that's still in Ecuador, but even those are trying to figure out ways to come north, understanding that the 2022 interim elections are going to be a problem, and then 2024 is going to be a dramatic problem in the United States, and there's no telling what's going to happen with the border. So it's a real pull-me force going on at this time.
And thank you. And will you be establishing a ground point across the Mexican border as well?
I can answer that kind of. What the picture that's on right now is the Guatemala-Mexico border. This is Tapachula for all intents and purposes. It's actually about 30 kilometers outside the city. These are families crossing. This is how they come across. They come across on these pontoon type of things. This is a family. This is actually a Honduran family who's paying the person to go back and forth. You can see the boats in the background. This is the way across. The bridge you see in the background is actually the legal crossing, and absolutely zero pay. This is all run by cartels. So there's no, you can come across and pay the coyotes. I'm not the coyotes, the people who bring you across without any interference whatsoever by the legal authorities. They go from here to Tapachula, which is a major city, and from there they're held. To get out of Tapachula and to move further north is another major problem. And when you hear in the United States, those who are listening in the United States, hear these stories of the caravans that are coming north. Tapachula is where they begin.
Okay.
And actually, I just heard a story the other day that there's another one coming, and I'm not sure if that was just some MAGA craziness or whether there really is an accumulation of people. But to get out of Tapachula is a difficult situation, particularly since the Trump administration and the Mexican administration got together with regards to paying Mexico to keep people in Mexico. Tapachula is the first place they're kept. Once they get out of there and get further north, there are other problems, and we actually are with a sister organization have a program in Tapachula for volunteer-driven as well as at the Texas-Mexican border in Reynosa, which is one of the major port crossings at the southern border. We actually have a presence there. We're about to build that presence and hopefully extend it along the border somewhat. But we are actively involved from Reynosa in the north, hopefully to the Gap, to the Colombian Venezuelan border and Norte de Santander, and even down into Ecuador where we had served before. And we have an active program that is just about to start up in that. We're blessed to get a large-sized grant to set up a program in Ecuador to deal with the Venezuelan population, both migrants as well as itinerant population. Angela and I just actually got back.
No, what you said is what is the reality right now. It's true what you're saying, John. Now it's on all newspapers, but this has been happening in the last few years. And we can find not only citizens from Haiti, and Cuba or Venezuela. We can also find people traveling from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Yemen, and other African countries who are trying to go up to the north.
From South America up to North
Yeah,
America.
so we're talking about a transnational migration problem in America. And I talk about America essentially because we also have people from the South American countries who are basically going up to the north to Ecuador, going to the Pacific Colombian coast, and arriving to these two locations because they are in that. Also, there was a recently increase in Colombia trying to use this route to get to the north, and of course, it's becoming a public health situation not only for Colombia or Panama or Guatemala or Mexico. I would say it's in general terms for all uh, America in any of the point. People from all the countries involved in this route trying to get up to the north, and of course facing one of the worst, described as a hell, uh, places in the world, that is the Darien Gap. So that's to summarize, of course, what we said.
Thank you very much. That's quite a dark picture from what I've been reading and from what you're saying. And we we do we do know that I'm guessing based on what's happening around the world that the situation is only going to get worse. And this is why we're doing this, to advocate for your work that is very inspiring, and to try to put it out there that we can use all the support we can get to continue doing this amazing work and helping everyone. That was my last question. If you have any calls or any comments, or let me check if we have any questions in the chat. We have a lot of comments. Let me see. We're open to receive any questions from our listeners.
Tanya, while you're looking at that, could you put the last couple of slides up, please? Well, I want to comment on a couple of things, please. The ones that start after the Tapachula.
You've both been so thorough that we so far don't have any questions.
Okay. Other way, please. Other way. This, by the way, this is one of the river crossings. It was low river at that time, and much higher than that. This is Venezuelans coming from Venezuela into Norte de Santander. They estimate anywhere between 6,000 and 12,000 folks come across that a day, come across something like this a day, and move on. Next one, please. Angela? So the bridge I showed you with all of the people crowded onto it, this is exactly the same place once COVID hit. It shows you the difference how fast they shut, and I mean they shut it down in a day. This was in one day.
There's a request for you, Dr. Keller, if you can share these slides maybe on our website,
Sure, we'll put them all up.
for people to maybe have a look at them or
Yep.
use them and reference them in their presentation.
Yeah.
So we might have these up on our MedGlobal website under the Columbia project for.
I think there's two more that we just put on today. Next slide, please. And next, that's a Darien Gap, by the way. Next one. One more, please. Is that it?
I think that's the
Okay, I thought we had a couple from our cross-border clinic is beginning to build because, as I said, the government is will eventually declare the humanitarian crisis done with. Maduro said there was no crisis. Duque said there was no humanitarian crisis. And Petro says, let's make the crisis, let's end the crisis. So all of this is happening. It remains the same on the ground for the poor folks that are traveling. But what they did do was at the base of the Simon Bolivar Bridge, which is the largest crossing and the largest cross-border crossing, is they shut all of the services down that the government had, other than services relating to economics. Because of that, our program, which is only about, I don't know, quarter mile, 500 meters maybe away from the base of the bridge, we anticipate the volume really increasing there because it actually is it will be the first contact that folks have crossing from Venezuela into Colombia. We anticipate that being a strong drawing point because in addition to medical services, it delivers other social services, but what trumps all of that is there's also a comedor. There's a soup kitchen there. And if you want to draw people in, help feed them, and that's very, very important. So we support that. We support financially the soup kitchen as well as the medical clinic in combination with a Venezuelan NGO called Funduta. It's a wonderful small place, and hopefully over the next couple of years, with appropriate funding, that we can help roll it out somewhat. It's also volunteer. For those of you who are on the call that want to volunteer, it's a volunteer-friendly clinic, as well as some of the other operations we have. And the project we're about to begin in Ecuador is also a volunteer-friendly place. So if you're interested in working in this humanitarian space in Latin America, we'll have opportunities for you in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Ecuador. Please go to our website. And
We have, yes.
What's your name?
We have contact our volunteer coordinator, so it's
Nice,
on the
nice.
website. Actually, Dr. Keeler, I do have one final question for both of you. I mean, we did talk throughout the whole webinar about, we're talking about physical health, but we didn't mention mental health. I mean, I'm thinking now when I'm seeing these pictures, and from my experience in the field in Lebanon, from what the Lebanese and the people living in Lebanon have been through, but going through all of that with your family, with your loved ones, losing loved ones along the way, pregnant women, all that stress, all that anxiety, do we have, or have we had any mental health activities, or do we have a plan for that?
The shortest of short answers is no. The longer answer is we have access. We had access at Comuneros, and I'm not sure how much access we still have to mental health services for pregnant women. Now that is obviously a very, very, very small part of all those who need it, given that 100% of people who are refugees will need some type of, could use some type of help. But the shortest of short answers is we don't have an active program right now. Angela?
Yes, you're correct, right? We always partner with organizations with large experience by managing mental health. And what we do, of course, is we refer our patients with, for example, IO1, psychiatric services, or specialized mental health services. So I would say that for now, that's what we have been doing. But I, of course, it doesn't answer your question, but this gives, of course, an update on what is the mental health situation in Venezuelan migrants and refugees this year, according to the Public Health Advance Report. Anxiety, attempt of suicide, and um, other mental health events are almost on the top 10 of reported public health events from Venezuelan migrants and refugees.
So,
And most of them, they said essentially that moving out from their country and basically losing their houses, jobs, and family has been extremely difficult for them, especially because they also have to face xenophobia in most of the country where they are planning to stay or establish. So this, of course, have been causing a lot of mental health issues on them.
so there was a question that about what are we looking to do in the next year? It's a fantastic question, and then strategically we're looking to do three things. In Colombia, we're looking to build our presence. We're looking to build the clinics on both sides of the border. We have our presence, but they need to be built and expanded. Services, exactly like you just asked about, need to be incorporated, which is mental health services. Um, we need to make the services on the Venezuelan side better so that women don't have to cross and go 20 kilometers in labor to deliver the babies. That's goal number one. Goal number two is to build our program in Ecuador to help. We partner with a large social service agency. We will be doing the medical aspect of it, but in that clinic, there will be mental health services as well as referral services. So we want to build that out. Luckily, we have a 1-year grant to do that. And then third, as we mentioned, we want to work our way north into Mexico, at the gap into Mexico, both in the south and Tapachula, as well as we want to build our services along the United States-Mexican border, because it's a fairly fluid border. People come from move into different areas at different times. So we are anticipating building some type of a mobile presence so that as the hotspot moves either east or west along the border, MedGlobal will be able to move east or west and help serve the medical needs of those crossing the border. What I've left out, which is glaring, relatively new here, is obviously I haven't mentioned services that we might be able to deliver to those migrants who got across and get bused to various and sundry places in the United States. Currently, that's being well handled by the Department of Public Health and that. But from a logistics and a logical standpoint, we should be standing with the migrants as they leave Ecuador and as they enter Chicago. We should be there for them all along that.
Well, we don't seem to have any more questions or comments, and we're almost at time, but thank you very much, Dr. Kaler and Angela. It's truly been inspirational reading about your work and just the amazing things that you do. I don't know if it almost feels the way, I mean, we do in Lebanon. There's so much work to be done, and no matter how much work you do, you just feel there's more to give, and it's just a drop in the ocean. So again, I always call out to please support our causes. We're here to help. We're here to support. Our mission is to provide healthcare without disparity all over the world. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for being with us and for this lovely discussion. And thank you very much. I don't see any questions. Bye.